Today's program, as mentioned, 6th birthday. We thought, actually, no, we are going to do it. We are going to continue to use this format to get out. And really, it's an opportunity for us to showcase. We've been doing a lot of research, and there's been a lot going on in the industry. So session one is all about that change. It's all about how do we transition to low carbon heat? How do we go through that transformation? There's a lot coming through from a regulatory perspective. We're going to go into that, talk about that. We've got CP1 2020 has just come through. We've got a couple of big things on the horizon in the shape of regulation and customer protection within that, and also heat network assurance. So we're going to talk through that. Session two, starting at 12 o'clock, is very much a technical showcase. It's going to go over a lot of the research we've been doing in collaboration with others. So we've got a lot of external speakers as well coming into that. We can talk about some things like domestic hot water, different approaches. And then the final session, again, really important, starting at 3:15, is about how we decarbonize heat networks. And that's taking two aspects. It's new build, how do we integrate, and predominantly around how do we get heat pumps into new build developments. And then the other piece is around how do we decarbonize, how do we retrofit, and then how do we decarbonize the existing schemes. And we've got BEIS there to talk around that, the HNU heat network opportunity, improvement opportunities, optimization opportunities, excuse me, program where we looked at 10 different heat networks and just taking some of the learnings from that. So I want to get on to session one because it's a great session now. It's all about how we transition to low carbon heat. We've got superstar lineup, and the format is we're going to have a series 6 talks. So 6 10-minute talks. The first hour is going to be taken up by talks, and then we're going to have a panel discussion and really take that through and take some Q&A from the audience. First up is Caroline Bragg, Head of Policy at the ADE, who's going to talk about regulation and direction of regulation for the industry and what the likely direction that's going to take. Shivali Mathur from Heat Network, who's a heat network specialist at BEIS, so Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We've then got Mariota Smutz, who joined us a few months ago, who's come in as Head of Policy and Assurance in FairHeat, who's going to be talking about assurance and the role that's like to play for heat networks. Phil Jones, I think most of you will know, independent consultant, who was the lead author of CP1 2020, who's going to be talking about CP1 2020, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. We've then got Tanya Groth, speaking to us from Denmark. She's director of SWECO, who did a lot of research, who did some research on skills gaps, going to talk about skills gap within the industry. We've got Noah Nkonge, who's going to come in to really talk about, he's head of partnerships at Vattenfall, who's going to talk through the industry response to this challenge, and particularly putting on a Vattenfall hat and what they're looking to do. So without further ado, I'm going to move on into the session. The other thing that I think was notable about 2020, other than the COVID and the impact, is we can't forget about the other big challenge we've got. 2020 was tied for the hottest year on record. The issue hasn't gone away. We had a minor sort of blip down in carbon emissions, obviously with lockdown across the world, but that's coming back with a vengeance. But again, it showed, I think the changes that we went through showed that we can make a difference. We can make a short-term difference, and we have to make changes. And I think that's really clearly illustrated here. When we're talking about heat networks, and fundamentally this is about heat, but it's also about heat networks, I think within the context of that change we need to make, and climate change and decarbonisation, heat networks are a demonstrated model for reducing carbon from heat. I know a lot of people have seen this before. What we've got on the left is heat supply to Swedish domestic district heating systems between 1969 and 2015 by heat source. And what we saw is a significant growth over a 40-year period there of supply from district heating, At the same time, over on the right, we've got the CO2 per megajoule of heat delivered. And during the early period, it was quite heavy in terms of carbon intensity. But then we've seen pretty much an almost total decarbonisation of heat over that period, particularly between the period of sort of 1980s through to 2000, start of 2005, if you like, where we've got that really big change. But the big change between sort of 1980 through to 1994, if you like, so that sort of 15-year period where we saw a really big drop off. I think that's the key lesson we've got here is heat networks are a really good model for decarbonising from heat. And that's been recognised. And that's why that's become a model that's being put forward. All the three different strategies that we've got from the Energy White Paper have a base case for heat networks. And heat networks are an attractive model for the UK. Particular reasons, it's technology agnostic and it's permissive, so you can have multiple generations of technologies, and that's what we saw in Sweden, where we had one technology then being substituted out for others. We saw thousands of megawatts of heat pumps come in the 1990s and substitute out coal. So it's great from a transitionary technology perspective. It also allows interaction, managed interaction between power and heat, and that's what we're seeing a lot of in Denmark now, that when power prices drop, you can have heat coming in and the real use of storage within that. Really importantly, we know it actually works. It's not a technology where we have to have big changes or be counting on future change. It's not CCS, it's not hydrogen. We actually have case studies of this working on large scale. Other technologies may well work, but here we have a technology that we know works. And we're also a really long way down the experience curve. We've been investing into this really since early 2000. We've had a couple of waves, but if we take the changes with back in 2006, co-sustainable homes, we had a lot of resurgence. So we've got the last really 15 years, we've been looking into heat networks. And I think we're a long way down the experience curve, but it is a big challenge. The numbers we talk around as a sort of a base level are 20% that we need to get to. I personally think that we shouldn't be stopping it for 20%. There's a lot of evidence we could go to 40% or even 60% if we look at the density of housing in the UK, density of heat, and look at other models across Europe. But if we just start at 20%, it's a massive challenge. And I'm going to do really back of envelope figures here, and I know all the engineers in the audience will shoot it down, but bear with me, we're talking about order of magnitudes here. If you just take your domestic fuel boiler capacity in the UK, 25 kilowatt average boiler size, we've got 24 million homes. That equates to about 600,000 megawatts of boiler capacity that we have to transition away over the next, let's say, 25 years. And if heat networks had been 20% of that, and I think that really is the baseline of what we should be aiming for, over a 25-year period, it's about 120,000 megawatts of boilers to transition away from, which is about 100 megawatts of boilers per week, or about 500 kilowatts of boiler per hour. Again, really, really rough numbers here. Just putting that in context, what that means is we have to have really huge continuous growth sustained over a 25-year period while decarbonising. So on the left, the photo there, I took this from the NG website. King's Yard is seen as one of the real flagship heat network developments in the UK, Olympic Park. This is the King's Yard energy centre on it. From the website, 45 megawatts of heat. So we have to, in terms of transitioning away of capacity, that equates to about 2 times this capacity every week. We need to do it on a zero or low carbon basis. Or on the right, we've got Queen's Quay up in Glasgow, beautiful development there at the top, energy development, taken from Star Renewables website. You've got the twins down bottom. We've got 2 water source heat pumps, 2.6 megawatts. Again, a fantastic flagship development. We need to be getting up to doing 2 of these every day. So that's again getting to 20% market share. That effectively implies a 11% cumulative annual growth rate every year, 25 years. Again, I don't think we should be seeing this as a, oh my God, that's too hard to do. It's a, oh my God, what an opportunity. And I think we do have a huge opportunity. And I think what we've seen over the last year is we can transform ourselves. We can transform. But it does mean that we have to tackle every single aspect of the industry. And we have to change every aspect. So we're going to now run through different speeches. So we've got regulatory changes. Caroline's going to go through that before we get into customer protection from Shivali. Assurance, Mariota's going to go through that. CP1 2020 from Phil Jones. Then we talk about skills gap with Tanya, and then how the industry is going to respond from Noah, followed up by a panel discussion. So first up is Caroline Bragg, who's head of policy at the ADE. Caroline, do you want to come in?
Perfect. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Gareth. So, as Gareth was saying, I'm going to give a quick overview this morning about the regulation and the policy that we can see coming forward in the next few years, and then where we might go after that, and its impact on heat networks, and more particularly the ability to decarbonise. Firstly, I think it's important when we consider this, just building on what Gareth has said, to consider the challenge that we have, and particularly on the customer side. Obviously, as many people talk about, we have made quite significant strides in terms of power decarbonisation over the last 30 years or so, but that has not been replicated yet in building sector emissions, and they remain roughly actually where they have been since the 1990s. On top of that, I think it's also important, sorry about that. I think it's also important to bear in mind that awareness of the challenge of heat decarbonisation is actually relatively low amongst the public. So last year we saw, 2 years ago now, only 49% understood that gas central heating was a source of carbon emissions, and less than 20% had considered switching to low carbon heating. You can also see that type of awareness replicated in people's understanding of heat networks in the UK. So, coming to that context, what are we going to see thrown into the mix in terms of policy and regulation in the next few years? What I'd like to do this morning is take you through, I think, 3 key themes that we need to think about. So that is policy and regulation that is specifically targeting the heat network market and what that might mean. Secondly, looking at broader questions of heat decarbonisation, where policy and regulation might go, and what that will mean in terms of its impact on the heat network sector. And then finally, I also wanted to add a few comments about future policy and regulation towards deep electricity decarbonisation. So, to start with, let's talk heat network regulation. As Gareth said, there is an enormous amount of policy and regulation that is coming forward this year and in the next few years. Obviously, what we have seen is local planning pressure towards decarbonisation continuing to grow, and I think we will continue to see that going forwards, particularly when you consider the local authorities that have declared climate change emergencies, and the steps that they might take to achieve that. Clearly as well, only last week, we had new building regulations in the form of the Future Home Standard, which will also drive particularly decarbonisation in new buildings. The other things that we see coming forward will have a very significant impact on heat networks too. This year, we have new metering and billing requirements, and then from 2022, we will have a general authorization and licensing regime for the heat network market that will include likely customer standards and redress mechanisms, technical standards for both new and existing heat networks, emission limits or some form of emission standards for heat networks, and for those who opt for the licensing regime, new powers in the form of statutory undertaker rights. Beyond this, and in parallel, what we are also going to see is new funding schemes in the form of the Green Heat Networks Fund from 2022, and also possibly the introduction of heat network zones that will give new rights and powers and incentives to connect to heat networks in particular areas. I think reflecting on this enormous amount of policy and regulatory activity in the next few years, there's a couple of questions that really stand out in terms of what this means for heat networks and what it means for their decarbonisation. I think firstly, this mix of policy and regulation needs to achieve quite a difficult balance actually between driving up standards, supporting customer outcomes, as well as ensuring that heat networks truly build their competitiveness and can incentivize connections from both new and existing buildings. And it needs to achieve that balance across the breadth of this sector, from the smallest heat networks right up to the largest citywide schemes. I think the other really important thing that this policy activity raises is that we need to make sure that this combination of policy, of new standards, of regulation, as well as some support, can create the conditions so that it is preferable, particularly for existing buildings, to connect to a heat network rather than a normal gas boiler refurbishment. Which leads me to the bigger question around what is going on with heat decarbonisation and where we might be in the next few years. I think in terms of looking at where government is going and what we might see, there are a couple of things that really stand out. I think in the heat and building strategy, in the net zero cost review and the net zero strategy, all of which are slated to be published this year, what we are hoping to see is a much stronger strategic vision from government for the relative contributions of different heat decarbonisation pathways and the decisions and actions that we need from government in order to support those pathways and their growth. The other really important thing for this discussion is the question around the relative costs of decarbonisation, and particularly between electricity and gas with respect to network costs, policy costs, and carbon taxation. And I hope that we'll start to see more coming out from government on this question over the next kind of 6 to 12 months. The other important thing I think to bear in mind when we talk about this is that there is also going to be a number of subsidy support schemes being put in place in the next few years to support these pathways. We can see it in the Clean Heat Grant from 2022 to 2025 to support heat pumps. There is also very likely to be new subsidy support coming forward for blue hydrogen and CCUS, as well as green hydrogen. And we already see new subsidy support schemes coming in for biomethane injection. I think reflecting on what this means for heat networks and what it means for their decarbonisation raises again a number of really important questions. Firstly, I think at the most political, the most strategic level, this is a really crowded field at the minute, with a lot of different visions for the future jostling for political and ministerial attention. I think it's really important for us and for the heat network sector more broadly that we are firmly establishing ourselves and continue to maintain our place at that table. I think secondly, there is still a lot to be won and a lot of opportunities, but also some risks in terms of how the shape and the detail of all of this regulation and policy that will come forward will reflect on its impact on the heat network market and how far it will support heat network decarbonisation. Finally, I think that raises some really quite big questions about the future of energy infrastructure in this country and how we pay for it. Over the next few decades, it's clear that I think the most likely outcome is we will see a really quite significant expansion of the electricity networks. We may well see new infrastructure being put in place for hydrogen, as well as the repurposing of the gas networks. and we will have new heat network infrastructure at the same time as potentially a shrinking of the existing gas network infrastructure in some places. And all of that needs to be funded and supported. I think the question of how we do that in a way that is equitable and is effective at incentivizing the right choice, the right infrastructure in the right place is something that is still very much an open question. And then finally, I just wanted to say a couple of things in terms of where electricity policy and strategy might go over the next few years and what it might mean for heat networks. I think for the purposes of our discussion today, the two really big questions are firstly, what the government will say over the next 10 years about how it will secure enough and the right types of capacity for a decarbonised electricity system. I think then secondly, there is an enormous piece of work to be done about increasing flexibility across the system over the next 10, 20 years. That comes from both on a national level in terms of the ability of the system operator to access and to source flexibility from smaller distributed assets. And it also brings into view the role of the distribution network operators, their likely potential transition to a distribution system operator, and an enormous uptake in their procurement of flexibility services. For heat networks and for their decarbonisation, I think that raises a number of specific questions. I think firstly, if we think that the vision of the future on the electricity system is for much more volatile pricing, real value and revenue to be had from being flexible, that raises a question firstly on the importance of making sure that heat networks can respond to that, making sure that we're not putting in place business models design that frustrate the ability to kind of respond to that, to make money out of these new markets, but also a real potential to really integrate these systems together to provide real system benefits on both the heat and the electricity side from the flexibility that we have within heat networks. So that's a very quick run through, but I'm sure we'll get into a really good discussion in the next little bit. Thank you so much. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you very much for that. Now, if I could pass over to Shivali Mathur from BEIS. Shivali, are you?
Yeah, Gareth.
Are you?
Thank you. Thanks, Gareth. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining early morning today. My name is Shivali and work in the Heat Networks Department at BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I would echo, as Gareth said, that let's see some positives while we celebrate FairHeat's 6th birthday. I'm trying to move this. It was working a little, yeah, that's it. And following some positive announcements, one from Prime Minister on the 10-point plan, which highlighted the importance of the role of green finance in the green industrial revolution. And second, the Chancellor announcing the spending review announcements, in which I would say it's a very challenging economic time for the country. But pleased to say that heat networks were mentioned in the announcing of £122 million of capital in 21-22. Last year, we were the first country to legislate and commit to net zero emissions by 2050. And I would say, I know Caroline's gone through some numbers from past, but just to see another positive impact aspect of it as well, that we have seen significant levels of progress since 1990 levels. In 2017, UK actually returned to energy-related emissions to those of 1888. And I would say that's a big achievement. We have, I think, made a really good progress in decarbonizing electricity. It's widely recognized now that decarbonization of heat is the next big challenge. Also transportation and industry impact. In our clean growth strategy, and also, as Gareth mentioned about the energy white paper, we have identified a few different pathways on heating the buildings. And in all of them, I would say heat networks play a key role. So these pathways are typically thought of the low carbon gas, hydrogen, green gas injected to the grid, or electrification pathways, such as the big heat pumps, electric heaters, hybrids. And as you all know, and reinforcing again what Caroline and Gareth said, heat networks are technology agnostic, which is what makes them so versatile. And we see them playing out a role in all the pathways, all the scenarios of electrification or hydrogen, and improving the effectiveness. One thing I would say that a position which has been consistent for the last 8 years in terms of our forecasting for long term, that heat networks will play a key vital role. That absolutely a key part of the future energy system. Oh, did I miss a couple of slides? Sorry, I'm just trying to get through the IT bit. Yeah. Sorry, Gareth.
Do you want me to click through?
Is a slide, can I go on to slide 3, please? If that's okay. Yeah, the one before this, please. Putting into perspective, today we have around 14,000 heat networks. Thanks, Gareth. Out of which 2,000 are district heating, serving around 500,000 customers. Largely gas-fired CHPs with peaking boilers. And right now, we have heat networks supplying around 2% of the UK's heat demand. But in 2050, the Committee on Climate Change estimates this could be as much as 18%. Personally, I agree with Gareth. As he said, it should be above 20%. But I like to put it more into the terawatt hours perspective. So thinking about terawatt hours, that's probably somewhere around 80 to 90 terawatt hours of heat delivered from district heat network at that time of 2050, which is a sizable chunk. And these numbers are driven by Committee on Climate Change and what they consider to be our most effective pathways to reach our carbon targets. So why do we like heat networks then so much? They do not save carbon on their own, but what they enable us is to unlock some of the really exciting large-scale carbon source of heat that's available right away across the country, whether it's waste heat from industries or heat coming from the energy from waste plants, mine workings. I think some of you must have seen Coal Authority publishing the heat maps recently, also from rivers, along the other host of sources. Because of the greater efficiencies, the improved performance, the ability to trade on the system, and I think Caroline mentioned about the role of flexibility and the role of ESOs and DNOs in this, and the ability of heat networks to store energy, to respond to the wider system. What we're doing is enabling a much more effective use of energy in meeting that demand. Now, really quickly, because I want to move to market framework bits, I'll whiz past through the UK government support, our support available on heat networks. In addition to our own team support, the government now backs the heat networks with more than £500 million, giving a strong signal of support there, namely with our flagship capital support program, the HNIP, so Heat Networks Investment Program with £320 million, which provides commercial and construction funding. Recently announced the £270 million Green Heat Network Fund, which is targeted to decarbonize new and existing heat networks. We're proposing a green gas levy on gas suppliers to support fund green gas injection to our gas grid. As government, we have been supporting since, I think, 2013, lots of local authorities, and proud to say that we have supported over 250 unique projects across 150 local authorities, from master planning to feasibility to detailed studies, with around investment of £23 million. The most exciting bit for this part of my presentation, which is consumer protection, is the next two categories, I would say. We are committed to developing a long-term market framework for the sector with the sole reason, with the heart of the heat network, which is consumer, enhancing the consumer protection, set out the standards, encourage the low carbon solutions, and promote investment. I think striking the balance between, for consumers and investors, getting the price right through the framework. The framework, our consultation closed in June last year, and thank you for the industry for putting your responses in. In addition to the city decarbonisation agenda, we have heard what industry has asked for and believe that heat network zones will have a big role to play in the expansion of heat networks. We will consult on the proposals in spring, which actually looks to knit together a coherent narrative for heat networks across the 2020s and moving forward. Thinking about coming in 2025 and starting to address that equation which we have in heat networks of risk-return equation, zoning could look to address the connection risk, which was, I think, touched base by Caroline quite nicely. Move to the next slide. Gareth, can we move to the next? Sorry. And the other one. I think I'll have to run through a few of them very quickly. Really quickly on the numbers from HNEP, we've spent around £125 million on the projects in the first 6 rounds, and I've been told recently that already the number has gone up in January. Some of the projects you've heard would be the use of abandoned heat from in Gateshead, from Mindwater, and also Cardiff, and then there are a few others. Let's go on our slide 7. So I'll briefly mention about the Green Heat Network Fund, which will help to build the momentum on previous projects. I think these slides are going to be circulated, so it's there to read. But just to mention one line about Green Heat Network Fund is it will ensure that there is limited to no funding gap for heat networks. So the sector is supported well, and especially towards our low carbon heat production and use of low carbon technologies. Moving on to more important bit of the market framework. Very pleased to say that when CMA the Competition Market Authority, they published their response to ensuring the sustained investment in protecting consumers in December, a couple of years, 3 years back. They recommended giving heat network consumers equivalent or similar protections to those in the gas and electric sectors. The consumer protection measures to be included in the general conditions that suppliers or operators will need to make under a general authorization regime. They've proposed the consumer protection measures should apply to domestic consumers, to micro businesses and others, reporting that requirements to be tailored to scheme size. So a lot was actually highlighted at that time and recommended. The letter went to the ministers in April 2019. Again, I would once again thank the industry for coming back with their responses last year when the consultations for market framework and metering and billing regulations was out. The market framework consultation closed in June 2020. And now the big circle in yellow is what our policy teams are working day and night, I would say, to drive the legislation and towards establishing the regulator. Why the market framework? And when we say market framework internally as well, the 3 big pillars which come to our mind is supporting the market, consumer protection, and decarbonization. These are the 3 underlying principles of this framework. The suppliers are encouraged to work towards their quality of service ahead of the regulation, I would say. Join the Heat Trust, the industry-led voluntary consumer protection scheme. A lot of work was done last year during COVID time as well, and I would say this, it was very nice to see in this pandemic situation as well, the sector to come along together and sign the consumer protection. Further work has also happened with Heat Network Exchange and emergency responders, which will be touch-based later on in the afternoon session. Moving on a little bit on, we've moved 2 slides. Sorry, I think we both are doing it, Gareth. Yeah. So the main, from a market framework perspective, the 3 key things, as I said, were what our pillars is decarbonization, consumer protection, and supporting the market. But what are the underlying principles for consumer protection? Transparency, the requirement to develop the information packs containing the minimum pre-contractual information, requirements on the provision of heat supply agreements, the minimum standards on billing, back billing, billing frequency. All these would help protect the consumers, make it more transparent. Second big thing, pricing. Powers for regulator to investigate whether the prices appear to be disproportionately high or mandatory price transparencies All these things are being worked at as we speak. Quality of service. One of the important things in discussion is also the statutory access to independent redress, like energy ombudsman. Sorry, I need to quickly move to the next slide, Gareth, please.
This one?
Yeah.
That one?
And
Yeah.
the next one.
This one?
Yeah. Yes, please. Thank you. Sorry about the citation. Supporting the market growth and investment. Again, we've highlighted, I would say I'll highlight it, that it is utmost important to build the heat network's reputation and regulatory certainty. And how? By introducing the regulatory framework equivalent to other critical infrastructure markets. Again, as CMA said, that equivalent to gas and electricity markets, driving up the performance of not so well performing networks and the outcomes for consumers, reducing the development burdens and risks. I think that's a big one, and I've heard a lot from the industry on the consultation as well. Introducing the statutory rights and powers equivalent to other utilities. What sort of powers would that be? So I'll just go a little bit into this because it's quite important. So that could specifically be permitted developments, classifying certain aspects of heat network development as not requiring planning permission, maybe. Easements, granting licensed rights entities the rights to apply for the right to purchase access rights over land. Street works, ensuring that heat networks can carry out the street works on the same permit system as other utilities. Consultation rights, commit to improve guidance on what heat network projects should be consulted about the developments that could affect them. There are linear obstacle rights, granting the licensed entities equivalent rights to cross the linear obstacles such as railway lines, tramways, canals. So lots behind these four focal points as well. Important again to support the heat networks as local solution. We've mentioned zoning a few times, and I'm sure it's going to come up in our discussion later from participants as well. Next slide, please. Thanks. Really quickly, because I'm mindful that yes, we are running over time, which is what I thought I'll get told off soon. But literally 30 seconds on this to go through an indicative regulatory structure in a visual way for everyone to understand the big picture. I would say from BEIS perspective, from the government, we are responsible for introducing the primary legislation, appointing the regulator, the grant easements, some of it which we touched a little while ago, set the decarbonisation target, provide the guidance and support to local authorities regarding the zones, regarding the concessions. And then we've got OPSS, the Office for Product Safety and Standards, who are already currently monitoring and enforcing the metering and billing regulations. Local authorities, very key as well. Part stakeholders develop the local approaches to decarbonisation. They may use the zoning arrangements as well. I mentioned before about energy ombudsman to handle the individual complaints. Again, consumer protection at the heart of the framework. Now, the regulator authorizing the schemes, setting the quality of service standards, again monitoring pricing, transparency, ensuring the regulated entities demonstrate the compliance and enforce the powers to compel the compliance. So that's to put into perspective. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Shivali. Thank you for that. We're now going to move on, following on from Shivali's presentation and talking about the different protection mechanisms that can be put in place, to Mariota Smutz talking about assurance.
Thanks, Gareth. Hopefully I can jump on and take over.
Just tell me to pass through in the meantime.
Oh, okay. Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Mariota Smutz, Head of Policy and Assurance for FairHeat. Today I'm going to discuss the role and importance of assurance and as we transition to low carbon heat. As Gareth mentioned, I've joined FairHeat a couple of months ago after nearly 20 years working in policy and regulation in New Zealand across a variety of portfolios: transport, electricity, medicines, public health, and urban development. Often within a position working with innovation and finding that sweet spot of flexing regulation and enabling growth. It's an incredibly interesting time to be in the UK and working within the heat sector. There's so much need for flex and change. And as Gareth and Caroline and Shivali mentioned earlier, there's an enormous amount of regulatory activity on the way. lots of questions to ask and lots of questions to answer as well. So some of the messages I'll share are not new, but they're an important part of our roadmap as we transition. Sorry, we'll go to the next slide. Achieving our net zero 2050 goals, virtually all carbon emissions from heat and buildings will need to be eliminated, and creates a significant coordination and delivery challenge for many sectors. Heating of buildings across the UK contributes to over a third of greenhouse gas emissions. And as you've heard already, it's the heat networks that will be instrumental in meeting our decarbonising ambitions because of their unique ability to use low or zero carbon energy sources. Logically, we need to accelerate the growth of this market. But how do we upgrade our supply chains, increase manufacturing, ramp up our skills and training, and provide certainty and gain confidence of investors? How do we deliver on our goals? These are issues we need to navigate really, really quickly. In order to accelerate growth, government estimates that up to £16 billion of capital investment is required from public and private investment. However, the UK's heat network market is immature compared to European countries, and therefore has not been able to organically grow and establish those quality practices over a time frame. Thinking back to Gareth's slide of decarbonisation in Sweden, we don't have 40 years to create our new norms, our stable growth for supply chains, materials, skills, and the labour market dynamics. We don't have that luxury of time to allow for organic growth. So how can we grow if there are significant quality issues to address? Our current market insights include that there is inconsistency in design and delivery of heat networks. There's a fractured nature of our market, and there's a lack of clarity of roles and responsibility, all leading to poor performance and poor outcomes on some schemes. If left as is, this risks damaging the reputation of the industry and failing to attract that much needed public and private investment. Next slide. Often we tend to look at these issues through the energy and climate change lens only. However, heat networks exist in that neat space across other regulatory regimes too. So urban development, planning and land use, quality safe buildings that meet our needs of how we live, work, study and play today and in the future are all mechanisms that are also in flux. As mentioned earlier, we've been upended through our experience with COVID-19. So how we build and where we build and the quality of our homes, creates an expectation of our service levels. And that expectation, of course, is through to our utilities that'll play a key factor. And no doubt, our panel members will turn their minds to later on. Creating quality heat networks are at the center of these, different regulatory decision-making frameworks. And it's important we can navigate all of them to help this market grow. Next slide, please. Within the context and horrific circumstances in Grenfell, many factors came together to produce a terrible tragedy, which could sadly have been avoided. Although in the context of building safety, these systematic issues identified here can be extended across to heat networks. Key issues identified by Dame Judith Hackett's report. There's a culture of indifference that perpetuates issues such as roles and responsibilities of those procuring, designing and constructing and maintaining buildings are unclear. The package of regulations and guidance in the form of approved documents can be ambiguous and inconsistent. The process that drives compliance with building safety requirements are weak and complex, with poor record keeping and change control. In too many cases, competence across the system is patchy, and the product testing, labeling, and marketing regime is opaque and insufficient. And most importantly, the voices of residents often goes unheard, even when safety issues are identified. We need a cultural shift away from this indifference to a culture of high performance. We can't grow a heat network market with confidence if we don't learn from this particular event. And it's really important that we get this type of systemic trend is absolutely applicable through to the heat network area. Creating a transformational cultural shift and sector-wide behavioral change is hard, and people and industries are comfortable at being comfortable. So to get to where we need to go, certification to industry specifications will provide a catalyst for real and significant change. The transition journey must begin with getting it right up front, as we don't have 40 years to allow for organic growth. We need to de-risk these projects by ensuring the design, construction, and commissioning of new heat network perform well, and existing heat networks perform absolutely well as well from the start, and equally reducing overall life costs. Consistent application of high quality standards through CP1 2020 and FairHeat experience is already underway. Our ambition for a heat network assurance scheme is to lead by example, keep customers at the heart of our decision making, and because if we certify high performing heat networks, we'll see a better experience for end customers and residents. And it can't be a rubber stamping exercise. Again, we need to avoid poor scenarios like Grenfell. Next slide, please. In many ways, innovation and change is not new. We've already begun, the journey for new norms and a new status quo in many different sectors. Home building, electric vehicles, they've really pushed, what customers want and their customer experience. And quality assurance and verification plays a real key role in enabling the market to operate well. So for instance, you've got financial fintech industries working closely with regulators in a sandbox. I mean, they continue to develop more products, enabling market forces to drive more consumer choice. It's really, really important. Often seen within the health and medical devices, there's a significant amount of flex required to deliver consistently. And we've seen this work, but we've also seen it fail miserably. And so there's still a work in progress here. Next slide, please. We're already starting to see high performance. And this doesn't happen by accident. This high performance is designed and engineered. The graph on the left represents performance we're seeing with an example from last week on one of the projects, with consistent low temperature flows and return rates, coupled with a fantastic quote from Claire Taylor. Since the scheme opened, the heating system has been fabulous. Residents regularly tell me that they've never had such low heating bills. It's a wonderful system for ensuring well-being of our residents. And that's Claire Taylor from the Guinness Partnership. Again, if we get a heat network performing well, end customers benefit significantly. Next slide, please. The Heat Network Assurance Scheme will assess conformity to CP1 2020, and this will be the lead for a cultural shift, lifting performance and operating as a key feedback mechanism to the industry as it grows. This in turn will unlock the market further and reduce uncertainty for investors. And we see assurance as being particularly important in this early phase as market stimulation is occurring. It's an essential ingredient to build confidence. Next slide, please. We've identified some key stakeholder benefits for assurance. From the resident end user, increased reliability, less likelihood of overheating and network interruptions, increased comfort, affordability, so it can contribute to reducing fuel poverty, improved experience when all of these above are in place. From the developer, there's value for money, leveling the playing field, ensuring practices are consistent across projects, and increased transparency of costs. Reduced risks, clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, and increased integrity of integrated planning. Skills transfer and verification to ISO standards, important feature of our heat network assurance scheme to provide high level of confidence across the industry. From an operator, clear delineation of roles and liability, less planned and unplanned outages, and reduced ongoing costs and maintenance. For the owner investor, again, so, increased confidence in the market and de-risking the project. Just a note here too, the government as a cornerstone investor will want value for money. The regulator, HNAS will give confidence to the regulator as it's likely to get intended outcomes, such as decarbonisation of heat networks. That assurance itself will be fantastic to help the market grow. Finally, our key takeaways. Decarbonisation and a well-performing quality heat network matter. We should be aiming to grow the market more than just 20%, and to be quite optimistic, we should aim for 60%. We're on a journey to lift performance, and heat network assurance schemes will be the catalyst to change. And we know change is hard. We need to find our new norm sooner rather than later. We don't have the luxury of 40 years to get it right. And we need to get it right from the start, taking in all the lessons we can from other sectors. I suppose the key message here, though, is if you're contemplating a new project, we strongly encourage you to start thinking about assurance now, as regulations for certification assurance will be brought in from 2022. Assurance and certification will be lifting performance, not just on your project, but also facilitating that important cultural shift for the industry and adopting new norms and practices, therefore accelerating growth and providing a real and tangible step towards our goals for 2050. Thank you. Hopefully I'm within time.
Thanks a lot for that, Mariota. That was great. We're now going to move on to Phil, and I think that's a really natural step on. Seem to have lost. Natural step on. Got Phil Jones, who's going to talk through CP1 2020.
It says you've stopped my video, Gareth. I don't blame you, but here we go. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can get to my slides in a moment, Gareth, but I'll take this opportunity to say happy birthday, FairHeat. You know, you grow year by year. Well done. But where's my cake? I'm Phil Jones. I've been 40 years spent 40 years trying to decarbonize buildings. The last 25 have been around heat networks. The last 5 have been around large-scale heat pumps on heat networks. And I've done lots of feasibility work across the UK on heat networks. So I am the lead author on CP1, and I think I was with you in RICS last year promising that CP1 would come out. There were some significant delays, but it's out. Hooray, at last. So there have been some very big changes, and I wanted to give you a flavour of them. Next slide, please, Gareth. So officially called CP1 2020 to differentiate from the 2015 version. It's a massive update. And one of the things we recognized is just how important the client briefing is. It sounds obvious, but I don't think we had enough emphasis in the 2015 version. And so we've now got the client briefing right at the heart of this whole process. And it is a process now, not just a series of technical minimum requirements. This will greatly improve procurement of heat networks, specification of heat networks, and the whole process from one end to the other. These are very long projects and complex projects, and we need to get them right from the start. But it's also the 2020 version has got much clearer roles, responsibilities throughout the whole project. There's a greater emphasis on compliance, and not just compliance at the end. There is little point in checking that it sort of maybe not works at operation. You've got to check it at every stage. And we now have a process within CP1 to check at every stage that client's brief is being met. Next slide, please. As part of that, we also have running right throughout the whole process and document performance metrics. And these are in the checklist that I'll talk about a little later, but these performance metrics are, again, set by the client and his team at the beginning, and then you check at the end of feasibility that you're still meeting them. You check at the end of a design that you're still meeting them, and so on and so forth. And they're fairly wide-ranging, and the client can add to these, but we've put in economic viability, reliability, efficiency, heat losses, environmental aspects. Next slide, please. So this is, as I keep saying, a huge update from 92 pages to 240 pages. I did suggest to Gareth that I'd just sit here and read it all out, but he wouldn't let me. 540 minimum requirements now, 110 best practices. So it has grown very considerably, both in width and depth and clarity. It is a much clearer document, I think. It is still a voluntary code of practice, but it is a code of practice, not a guide. It sets minimum requirements. If the client says, I'm going to do CP1 2020, then you've got to follow it. There are elements that you can actually drop out, but you've got to put forward clear justification as to why you might do that. Lots of improved definitions as to what is district, what is communal, and also around the primary, secondary, and tertiary bits of the system, their heat losses. And we've started to set clear minimum requirements. Actually, it's a maximum, but it's a minimum requirement within the document, if you know what I mean, around heat losses. And what was one of the big problems that we've had over the last 5 years? Absolutely, the secondary heat losses, hot corridors. And so we're setting performance measures and maxima around that. Next slide, please, Gareth. We've also worked very hard on diversity, and huge thanks to my co-author, Paul Woods, for his very hard work on this. We are now focusing just on DS439, Danish standard. We've now, thanks to BEIS, translated that into English for the UK market. And we've also provided some guidance on space heating diversity. So much more clarity, but much greater clarity on how you use DS439. And there is a very, very good now Annex D developed by FairHeat. So thanks to FairHeat, well done. And that is the sort of diagram at the bottom there, showing a whole process, an example, a case study, if you like, of how you should, and therefore how you should not use DS439. It was being misused after the 2015 version. This is all about tackling the massive issue of oversizing. Next slide, please. So again, huge thanks to my other co-author, Martin Crane, for fantastic work on acceptance testing. We now have a whole new objective. Even in CP1, objective 5.7, setting a whole raft of minimum requirements around how do you do acceptance testing. You can commission a system, but generally that means you turn the pump on, you look at it and you say, oh, it works, great. And you write a number down that you may well have made up. But actually what acceptance testing is about is proving the service to the customer works. We've taken a graduated risk-based approach. So if you're rolling a development out, what is the point in doing acceptance testing on the first 10%, finding there's a generic problem, and then letting it roll out on the other 90%? So actually fix what you see early on. But best practice is to actually carry out independent acceptance testing on 100% of dwellings. And we've now got, and this only went in fairly recently, hence some of the delay, a new requirement on hot water delivery times for 45 degrees C within 45 seconds. That is a customer service and a piece of acceptance testing. And we've put a checklist in that you can see on the right there. So a lot more on proving it works. Next slide, please, Karen. We've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years working on heat interface units, and well done to Gareth chairing the HIU BEIS testing standard committee, and I happen to be a member of that. So we've now got a really good standard for testing heat interface units. CP1 actually says use HIUs that are tested to at least BEIS HIU standard or similar. And there's much more emphasis now in CP1 about achieving low return water temperatures. CP1 best practice says a VWART of less than 33 degrees C. So you can see the direction of travel there for around HIUs. Again, a change to hot water temperatures that I'm sure Andrew Mackay will talk about later, but actually instantaneous HIUs should supply 50 degrees C, no longer 55. So again, a reduction in temperature, but with very strong safety considerations around all of that. Huge thanks to Hugh Blackwell for all his work in that went into CP1 around avoiding oversizing of HIUs. And we now have statements in CP1 saying that for a typical dwelling, you shouldn't need more than 35 kilowatts. So fantastic. People were putting in 70 kilowatts, and you know why. And we've actually got, again, as an example, I'm just picking out one or two bits here and there, CP1 saying heat losses from HIUs should be a maximum of 1 kilowatt hour per day, best practice 0.7. So a lot of work on HIUs. Next slide, please, Gareth. So I'm very pleased that customer satisfaction now runs as a theme. Although it is stage 7 in CP1, it starts at the briefing stage. And so the client actually now has to set down an intention to join up to the heat trust or a similar regulatory scheme, not regulatory, but a similar customer protection scheme. And they sign up to that intention right from the beginning, and customer satisfaction now runs right throughout the whole process. So it's not just a technical set of minimum requirements. There's lots around reporting back to the customer, better information to the customer. As I well know, if Mrs. Jones is not happy, then you know, we failed. And so I think this is a very important theme in CP1. Next slide, please, Gareth. So compliance, compliance, compliance. CP1 has an accompanying set of checklists, and as ever, people download the document and they sort of forget about the checklists. These are not add-ons. They're a fundamental part of proving that CP1 has been followed and documented, and providing an audit trail. And you can see a snapshot on the right hand side, and these are stage by stage checklists, and they are actually checking, have you met the objectives at the top? In the middle, have you met the performance targets? And at the bottom, signing off and handing over that stage of the work to the next feasibility consultant, and then so on to the design consultant. So it's a stage by stage process. If you don't look at these Excel spreadsheets and checklists, you don't know CP1 end up. I think, sorry, just go back. I think this provides a platform for assessing 2020 CP1 requirements have been met, but in an outcome-based way at every stage. Next slide, please, Gareth. And that relates very heavily to building an evidence pack. So the checklists go into, at every stage, into an evidence pack. The performance monitoring at every stage goes into the evidence pack. The feasibility study then goes into the evidence pack, and so on. The feasibility study then gets clearly handed over in the evidence pack to the designer, and so on down the chain. This actually is a process rather than just a set of technical requirements, and it provides a connected audit trail that is fundamental to these systems. Given that they are so complex and so many people are involved over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this audit trail and evidence pack is going to be absolutely key, and I believe will be part of the underpinning piece around regulatory, the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So that's me almost done. There is lots more. As I say, that's only a snapshot of what is in CP1. I think it's a huge step forward. Huge thanks to my fellow authors, Paul Woods and Martin Crane. We've all got lots of scars on our back, but it's been worth it. Huge thanks to the expert steering committee of up to 50 people, including corresponding members, well over 100 contributors and commentators, thanks to them. And poor old Phil, Paul and Martin had to go through over 3,000 comments over 3 rounds of consultation. But particular a message back to Mike Ridge and Tom Norton and Gareth is huge thanks for all your input. You've had a massive input, including that appendix. So an epic journey of probably 2.5 years, huge consensus. It is still work in progress, in my view, on a much longer journey, but it does provide a platform for the future. I do believe it will underpin the regulatory framework that was talked about earlier. May the code be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil, and congratulations. I think it's a big step forward for the industry. We're now moving on to dealing with the issue of the skills gap. We've talked through the big challenge we've got for the industry, and we've now got Tanya Groth from Sweco going to talk to us about the skills gap and the research that's been done on that front.
Thanks, Gareth. Also, I'd like to really congratulate Phil on getting that out into the industry. I know my colleagues, SIPSI colleagues, they are keenly going through it at the moment. I think it might have been the most hotly awaited book to land in 2021. So congrats again for getting all of that collated and published. Yes, I'm presenting on the basis of research that was conducted in 2020, and that is on the status of heat network skills across the UK. And this was research that was conducted with our partners. Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide. There we go. Collaboration with key partners, the ACE research team from the ADE, IFF research, ourselves as a minor party, and then of course a shout out to particularly Melissa and Brett at the Clean Heat Directorate, who were our clients and who contributed significantly to the report itself. Key points I want to, sorry, it's still not. Am I in charge still of the screen, or somebody?
Unfortunately, it's not. You let me know, and I'll let you know when it goes across.
Perfect. Thanks, Gareth. So just quickly overview of the different project stages. Basically, this was a literature review plus stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement was one-to-one telephone conversations and workshops. Please click through. Covered about 6 months of research, and then we published, drafted and published the report. Key findings. Good news, the industry currently across the UK is well equipped and able to accommodate the current size of the heat network market. But as Gareth, Caroline and Shivali were commenting earlier, there's going to be a step change in how quickly we're going to be delivering heat networks going forward, and what we are not ready for is that step change. Also, what was flagged was a lack of diversity in a gender diversity in a male-dominated industry, but somewhat more positively, I guess, was there isn't much concern about an age gap, in that there's not in other industries face a current risk that senior members of the industry are retiring, and there's a knowledge gap left behind. The heat network industry in the UK, partially because of its youth and energism, and partially because the demands and the technologies within the sector are innovating so quickly, is not facing that same age skills gap. So that would be the positive story on that. Next slide, please, Gareth. This is a slide that demonstrates all the different sectors that contribute to delivering a heat network project across its lifetime. Actually, it's not all of them; it's most of them, I would say. As we all know, heat networks are incredibly complex, not just because of the way they interface with building construction and energy efficiency improvements and the electricity system and different fuel arrangements, but also because of that stakeholder engagement piece, which is so crucial, understanding the customers, understanding their thermal demands, both on heating and hot water, understanding comfortable heating for them, explaining to them how their heat network system works. So across the kind of life cycle of development of a heat network project, you get various varying degrees of involvement from different sectors across the industry. Next slide, please. And just click through, I think. So a great example of this is, and stop when you hit project management there, thank you. A great example of this is if you look at what the role of a project manager in a heat network is, they really need to be able to understand the construction and surveying bits, the engineering bits, the architecture bits, the public administration and urban planning, legal and financial, energy supply, IT, installation, the whole shebang they need to be able to get on top of. Click once more, please. And I have to, yes, perfect, just keep clicking twice more. There we go. In terms of that, I've have a newfound respect for project managers within the heat network industry. In terms of skills and challenges identified across the industry, the blue points kind of highlight particular issues that we're facing. Restricted recruitment pools, partially because the younger generations, the ones coming fresh-faced out of the universities, aren't necessarily aware of what heat networks are. Linking back to that slide Caroline was presenting earlier from the research done by the Energy Technologies Institute on knowledge about what heat networks are in general, I think. You need a blend of skills. It's necessary to function as in the heat network industry. For myself, I'm an economist, but in order to work in the heat network industry, I really do need at least some understanding of technologies involved and how the components link into one another. Also need to understand bits of stakeholder engagement and a little bit of legal and IT skills on top of that. And that's just as an economist, and my role is very trivial in terms of a heat network delivery. But that blend of skills is necessary. So you don't tend to see a lot of engineers working across multiple sectors and partially working on heat networks. They really do have to have a solid foundation of what a heat network is, which is why it's so great that, again, that the update to CP1's come out. 3 skilled senior roles are in short supply. So we don't have a lot of existing knowledge to lean on, because the industry as a whole has been less developed. And that also means that the fact that the industry as a whole is less developed also means that individuals' roles can't solely be focused on heat networks, because there might not be enough of them for them to fully focus on it, which is a bit of a conflict, right? Because on the one end, you need someone with a solid grounding of heat networks and to really specialize in understanding what a heat network is. But on the other hand, we might not have enough work to fully keep them occupied. And then 5, fewer graduates also attracted into the sector. It's not as sexy as electric vehicles, where you've got Tesla looking cool, riding fly. It's not as cool as working on the really large scale wind turbines. At least that's the perception. It's something we probably as a sector need to invest more time in making look good to attract others. Please click on the next slide, Gareth. So skills lacking by occupations. Again, project delivery managers, specifically around really understanding what a heat network is. You also get things like legal advisors. They really need to understand where all of the risks are in terms of a heat network, and the amount of risks involved in building a heat network, from technical, from in customer expectations point of view, from IT angles, all of that is so tricky. So if you are setting up contractual agreements and you don't understand where all those risk elements are, that can create a lot of challenges going down the line. Thank you. Click on next slide, please. So current skills gaps and the impacts on networks. What do we get? We get delays to the development of heat networks because finding the right people with the right skills to deliver heat networks takes a longer time. I think anybody involved in public sector procurement knows how difficult it can be to get consultants with the right type of experience bid for a role, or the right type of contractors who have the same technology experience as the specific technology chosen for the initial heat network. You get lower quality projects. We've all seen examples of those. They cost more to deliver because skills are at a premium. And then there's a reliance on subcontractors, and that can create issues. It can also be great. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but generally speaking, when you don't have enough understanding in-house, it creates issues. For example, going back to Phil's presentation around setting up that client brief, if the client doesn't have those skills in-house, they might have to rely on subcontractors, and that isn't always optimal. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? Well, in the short term, there's a number of initiatives that are being explored. So employer-led partnerships, encouraging trade associations to respond to calls for evidence, promoting the sector to young people, and then liaising with energy hubs and local enterprise partnerships. Midterm, you've got, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I would say encouraging the CPD schemes and also exploring the collection of data so we can keep an eye on it. This study, this heat network skills study, which was undertaken alongside a similar one for Scotland, similar time frame, and also had similar findings, which was, I guess, a relief for both of us, is that there's not a lot of data on heat network skills out there. These were the first. Last year was the first year we actually did, there was actual proper research conducted into what the status of heat network skills in the UK is, what are the gaps, what do we need to be doing. And then finally, looking at longer term initiatives. And it was really great to see that there are specific targeted courses being drafted now for university students up in Scotland. It's something that would be great to see more widely as well, but it's, you know, starting with that longer term investment into the education and skills that we need for the industry. Next slide, please. This is just coming to the end now. So these are a number of initiatives that are going on at the moment. You've got the Heat Academy, you've got the Heat Network Industry Council, the Heat Network Exchange, et cetera, the Heat Exchanger. And a shout out to my colleague Mert, who helped with the SWECO side of the Heat Network Skills research, and who's also was one of the first mentees in the Heat Exchanger program and has been actively involved in the second round. I think that is a great mentee mentorship and addresses some of the particular challenges we found in our study, which is about how do you insource more skills in a smaller organization where you might not have access to the same training and development opportunities, or can lean on senior members of staff to the same degree because the organization is too small to sustain them. So the Heat Exchanger is a really great initiative launched through the membership of the District Heating Divas originally, which is also surprised to see how many women actually were involved in the heat network industry in the UK. I had not expected it to be the several hundreds that are now members of the Divas, but it's been reassuring to see. And then the final slide. So that was pretty much it from my end for this. Feel free to pop questions through the chat to discuss through our panel discussion later. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Much appreciated. Okay, so we're now final talk before we have a discussion. Noah Nkonge is going to talk to us about Vattenfall's view of how the industry will respond to this.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you, FairHeat, for inviting us to speak today. I'm going to be covering...
We're having problems here. Just tell me when you want me to swap.
I'm going to be covering the view from industry on all the excellent presentations that have come before. Looking at the decarbonisation challenge, and then also talking about the role of regulation. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to do my best to not go over the same ground that's already been covered beforehand. So let's go to the next slide, please. And just before I get into the core, I just want to give a very brief introduction, because some people may not know who Vattenfall is and what we're doing here. So Vattenfall is one of the is the 5th largest energy company in Europe, and across the heat business, we have about 1.8 million customers. And Vattenfall is a sort of integrated energy company across electricity, heat, gas, and energy services. And we have large heat networks across in Amsterdam, in Berlin, and also in Sweden. So if you, next slide, please. And Vattenfall decided to enter the UK market about 3 years ago, because as Shivali was mentioning, there was the government support with the funding, those commitments, the binding climate change targets, and also property developers and local authorities were calling out for heat solutions that would allow decarbonisation of their developments. And what I really wanted to bring out from this slide is the type of projects that relate to what we think needs to happen in terms of the scale and the ways of working to meet net zero from the heat network perspective. And this is very much along projects that have the potential to build up at scale and working in partnership, bringing together local authorities, private developers, and waste heat sources as well. So Brent Cross South is an example where we're working in partnership with a private developer to regenerate an area in North London, which would serve about 10,000 homes equivalent. In Midlothian, we've been selected as an energy partner for the council. Initially looking at a scheme of about 3,000 homes, but this has the potential to expand northwards and capture existing buildings. And then Corey Riverside as well. We've got partnership there with the energy from waste operator. Again, potential for 10,000 homes initially, that could expand up to 75,000 homes in due course, and then capturing the existing buildings as we go. Next slide, please. So this slide covers a lot of the similar ground actually that's been talked about in terms of the scale of the challenge. And I think from your numbers, Gareth, it translates to about 500 boilers a day that we need to be taking out and replacing with low carbon heat solutions if we're to meet our net zero targets. And really, I'll just jump to say, the key thing is that we've got a big challenge ahead of us. And, as there hasn't been much increase in the penetration of heat networks over the last few years, and therefore we will need that some support from a market framework to help that. And we've covered a lot of those themes already. And let's move on to the next slide, please. I think Phil talked really well about the whole process, and I'm really excited to see the launch of CP1 and those checks that are going to happen at each of those stages. And really what I want to communicate is that us as an ESCO, as part of our business, we come across standards all the way through the project lifecycle, all the way through design and operation. And one thing that we're keen to do is work with our clients very early, as early as possible actually, up at the design stage, even if somebody else doing the design, because we know how important it is to get good standards in, because that will affect the operation over 30, 40, 50 years plus of a network. Yeah, next slide, please. So, as an industry, as an ESCO industry, we cannot afford to wait for the government before we start adopting these common standards. We've already got CP1 here. We don't need to wait for regulation to start telling us to use these excellent standards. And ultimately, they'll be of benefit to all the different stakeholders. They'll drive up quality in the heat networks. They'll drive down cost and risk. It'll make the job a lot easier for clients who don't have to look at different specs and different designs and get confused about that, and iron out the risk in delivering projects, because there's that clarity of, the heat network is going to do what it says on the tin, to paraphrase Phil. And it's good for our customers because, as was mentioned, there's a low understanding of heat networks and heat decarbonisation options in general, actually. And so we need to build consumer confidence and have reliability and peace of mind, not only for the end customer, but for developers who are going to be working with those customers ultimately in the buildings. And for ESCOs and the industry, it's great because we get the shared learning through, for example, that's captured in those, example in the codes of practice, etc., which helps streamline the design and de-risk the delivery of heat networks, which actually means that the cost of capital can go down once we have a better understanding of performance. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our approach is to be ahead of regulation as Vattenfall. We welcome common technical standards, and we're already designing and delivering our heat networks now to be compliant with what we expect the standards to be, or some cases exceed, where that's appropriate. So we're comfortable with regulation from our European operations. There was already mention of the Scandinavian, the Danish standards used for the sizing of pipes, for example. And we haven't been waiting for CP1 to start implementing some of the guidance that's already in there. So the use of low temperature heat networks. We don't specify CHP and gas boilers as part of our mission. We want to be fossil free in generation and power climate smarter living. So what that means for us is we don't specify any fossil fuels where possible. We don't specify gas CHP. It's very hard for us to get projects approved by the business that still include combustion. And if there is a need to have gas boilers, for example, for peaking plant, there's always needs to be a route to zero carbon. And that relates to that last bullet point about the specification, for example, of 50 degrees hot water production at heat interface units, because that really opens up the potential to make use of waste heat from the local environment, which is a key pillar of how we approach projects. Before putting in new equipment, we really need to make use of the heat that's available in the local area. Next slide, please. So yeah, to sort of bring that all together, to meet the heat decarbonisation challenge, we're very supportive of a market framework that will unlock this, and that includes regulation and assurance. And we're keen to work with all stakeholders to help with this. We are represented on the boards for the Heat Network Industry Council, which is looking at pathways for achieving heat decarbonisation. I myself am chairing the working group on smart livable cities, which looks at zoning, how we address the retrofit market, and importantly also digitalization, because as a couple of the speakers mentioned, there's going to be a coupling of electricity and heat and opportunities with the flexibility market. And so what's going to be really important with heat networks is how do we know what's happening on the heat network to allow us to, for example, reduce the strain on the electricity grid, as an example. And as I mentioned, we want to be ahead of regulation, and we cannot afford to wait if we're to meet the heat decarbonisation challenge. So next slide, please. So yes, thank you everybody for listening, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.